is a listening technique, and the idea is to put boundaries on your interaction with one another. I can honestly say that without this listening technique, I don't think my husband and I would have made it. I think we might have gotten divorced a long time ago. When my husband and I got together, we were not very good communicators. And like most couples, we're opposites, so naturally we agreed on very little. It took us a long time to learn how to communicate with one another, negotiate, and compromise. And the 10-5-10 gave us the tools in order to do that. We learned this technique from another counselor years ago, but unfortunately, we can't remember his name. But I owe a great deal of debt to whoever did create it, because the reality is it saved my marriage. Before we get into the 10-5-10 technique, we need to talk about what typical conflicts look like. We'll put numbers on the side of our graph to represent the intensity of the argument. 1 being the argument is not intense at all and there's just talking, to 10 being there's yelling and screaming and possible throwing of things. We'll consider this scale, 1 to 10, the temperature of the argument. What typically happens in an argument is that one person in the couple will be frustrated and they will come to their partner with a frustration. And because they are frustrated and there's a little emotion to it, the intensity of the argument grows a bit. Once the other person realizes that this argument might have something to do with them, they become defensive and many times they interrupt the conversation. They might have explanations, denials, justification of how things went down. This, of course, does not solve the problem, but only infuriates the first speaker, who then begins to interrupt their partner. This pattern continues until the intensity of the argument is pretty high. No one is listening to one another, and none of the problems are actually being resolved. This is common in many relationships. It's hard to resolve problems when neither is listening to the other person or trying to understand. When a conversation escalates this much on our scale and becomes really intense, there's one of two things that can happen, and neither are good in a healthy relationship. The first thing that can happen is it can escalate and become violent, physically, emotionally, or verbally. The second thing that happens is that problems do not become resolved and can carry on in the relationship for years. I have heard of couples who are still struggling with things that happened years ago in their relationship, and they just can't find resolution. And part of the problem is they don't listen to one another. So the 10-5-10 is a technique that can be used when the conversation is likely to be emotional or intense. This technique is not for simple things like, honey, you forgot to take out the garbage, or hey, who's picking up the kids after school today? The 10-5-10 is for those conversations that we know are really difficult to talk about. The 10-5-10 gives boundaries or rules on the way that we communicate. For the first 10 minutes, one person gets to talk. The other person just listens. They don't interrupt, they don't ask questions, they don't ask for clarifications, and no, you cannot take notes. Then there's a 5-minute break. You should be taking a timeout. If you need ideas on what to do and what not to do in the timeout, please look at our timeout video in this series on communication. Then, the next person gets to speak for 10 minutes without interruption, and again, the same rules apply. The other person just listens, does not interrupt, does not ask questions, does not ask for clarification, or take notes. That is also followed by a 5-minute break or timeout, and then the first person gets to talk again using the same formula. The 10-5-10 keeps continuing on and on until there's resolution to the problem. Don't think this is an easy way to get out of resolving problems and that it is going to be quick. It's not. The first time we ever used the 10-5-10, it took us 4 hours to get to a resolution. You might not be as stuck as we were or as stubborn, but it does take quite a while to resolve the problem and make sure that you're listening and include the breaks in between. If we go back to the temperature gauge that we started with, we can see how this conversation is different. In the beginning, as the first person speaks, there is a slight escalation because it is, again, an emotional topic and they're frustrated. So as they talk, they start to get a little bit more intense. As the person continues and is not interrupted, they seem to naturally de-escalate. After the 5-minute break and the second person talks, they also seem to get escalated and can even get more intense than the first person. However, if they are also not interrupted and are allowed to continue their thoughts, they naturally de-escalate themselves as well. There is a bit of an escalation, but again, as a person is allowed to continue their thoughts and think through things and really explain themselves, there is a natural decrease in their own intensity in the argument. As the conversation continues and both are following the 10-5-10 rules, there is more listening and understanding in order to compromise. And also, do not be fooled. It is really hard to stay silent when the other person is talking for 10 minutes and you don't agree with what they are saying. I can remember on many occasions dying to interrupt my husband because I didn't agree with what he was saying and I had an excuse or a justification for why I did the things that I did. And what I realized after a while is that when I listen, and I mean really listen, he's not such a bad guy, and we actually can find common ground. But many times, because I was interrupting and he was interrupting me, we weren't really listening to what the other person had to say. We were listening to the beginning of the argument, but we didn't understand the meat that was underneath it. But once we were able to really listen to one another, those problems in our relationship that seemed unsolvable finally found resolution. Once we found success using the 10-5-10, even though it took us 4 hours, we were off and running, and we continued to use that throughout our relationship. We have also used it with our kids and other people in our family in order to make sure that we're listening and that we can come to a resolution of the problem. Again, remember, the purpose of listening is to understand so that you can come up with a possible compromise and/or solution. The purpose of listening should not be to figure out how you can win the argument. Our next video in our series on communication is how to have clear communication.